Okay, I think we should probably get started if everyone can hear me okay. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a great crowd today, which is not surprising given the amazing speaker we have today and the topic that we'll be discussing. So I'll just quickly give you some ground rules happening that everyone is going to be muted during the time that we'll be talking. The session is being recorded, and the way you ask a question is to write in the chat room to either everyone or just to Miles Rappaport, and he'll be conveying to me those questions halfway through we get to the Q&A with the audience. I will just introduce myself really quickly. I am Tova Wang. I am research fellow at the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. I have been working on voting rights and election reform and making elections and voting and political participation in general more inclusive. I was thinking back over my career and realizing how long I have had the pleasure of knowing Rick and some of the battles that we've been through over the years that continue. So let me just go ahead and thank Rick for coming today, and especially virtually. And I would just, again, thank everyone for joining and say this is kind of the first event that we've tried to do this way virtually. So far, so good. But if there are mechanical difficulties, technical difficulties, please bear with us. We will try our best. So I will give you the official bio of Rick, and then I'll tell you a couple other things. He is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. In 2013, he was named one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America by the National Law Journal, and his previous books include Voting Wars, Plutocrats United, and The Justice of Contradictions. His op-eds and commentaries have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and Slate. Hasen also writes the often quoted election law blog, and you can read more at www.electionmeltdown.com, which is the name of the book. And I will just add my own 2 cents, which is basically Rick is probably the most well-known and most go-to guy election law scholar in the country, and for good reason. And like I said, we have been people who have been working in this field together for 20 years. And his latest book is in fact called Election Meltdown. And he talks about in the book the 4 ways which in tandem the election system could break down or be broken. He didn't quite predict a pandemic, but kind of close. He has in one part of the book that American law is a patchwork of federal, state, and local election laws, many of which are inadequate to deal with natural and man-made emergencies on election day. After September 11th, 2001, attacks on the World Trade Center, which was an election day in New York City, and a series of debilitating hurricanes in Florida and Louisiana, election scholars have sought to have states come up with rules for dealing with terrorist attacks and disasters on election day. But most do not have adequate plans or legal rules in place for dealing with disasters. And US presidential elections present an especially difficult challenge because of our uniform national election day. So he was somewhat prescient. And so I thought, for obvious reasons, that we would spend the first good chunk of this talking about the coronavirus and the impact that it will have on the elections, Rick's thoughts on all of that, and suggestions, recommendations, given the opportunity to have him come and speak to that. And then we'll get into some other parts of the book that are still relevant and will certainly be relevant in the years to come. And so let's start briefly, Rick, if it's okay with you, with how the coronavirus has been impacting the primaries, the ones that have already taken place and the ones that would have been forthcoming and will be forthcoming. What do you think the response has been like to date, and what do you foresee happening or should be happening in the primaries that are upcoming, and how those decisions have been made as well?
Sure. Well, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
This is the first virtual book event I've done, and it happens to coincide with Garbage Day on my block. So hopefully there won't be too much ambient noise. I'll try muting when you're speaking. So, you know, it's been a few months where there have been concerns about the virus and it was going to affect elections, but it was really, I think now 2 weeks ago when we had primaries scheduled in 4 states. This was Ohio, Arizona, Florida, I'm forgetting the fourth state. And at the very last minute, Ohio decided to call off the election. And that was a kind of a mess, because what happened there was the governor first said he didn't have the power to unilaterally stop the election. But then after a failed attempt to get a court to stop the election, he had his health official close the polls down, which then led the Secretary of State to reschedule voting. And there's now been some fighting and negotiating with the Democrats in the state legislature over what exactly the rules are going to be in Ohio. So those people in Ohio who were supposed to vote, that voting is being continued. Voting did take place. Oh, Illinois was the other state. And there were problems in Illinois, in Arizona, and Florida at certain polling places. We had election judges not show up, people being deputized in Illinois with no training over whatsoever. Election judges. These things are, potentially a problem in terms of voter turnout and skew. So it was kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation in that particular election day. What we saw since then, I think, is uniformly everyone deciding to, every other state that had a pending primary decide to delay that primary. And there's going to be a lot more vote by mail. There are already some special elections that are being scheduled for vote by mail, but everyone is focused now on what's going to happen in November. And I'm sure we're going to get into that. Just this morning, the news came out that there's some funding, not nearly enough funding in the expected phase 3 bill to deal with the virus. So we're like right in the middle of all of it. And, already we know that campaigns and campaigning, voter registration drives, and actual turning people out to vote is going to look very different if we're still in the throes of this come the fall.
So did you feel like the primaries being postponed and some of them to a date uncertain, I guess, was the right way to go? And do you feel that the ways those decisions were made were legally and otherwise appropriate?
Yeah, well, so as I note in Election Meltdown, the way Americans conduct elections is highly decentralized. And so rather than thinking of, say, a single election day in November, we actually have something like, or a single election being held in November, we actually have something like 8,000 or 9,000 elections being held in November. As because of that high decentralization, that means the rules are different everywhere. And if you talk about the rules for postponing a primary, if you ask me, was it legal for Ohio to have postponed the primary? The answer is, well, I'm not an expert in Ohio law, and it really depends on what the state constitution and the state statutes allow. As I understood it, it was really up to the state legislature to be the one that would have to move the primary. But I know there are others, including Professor Foley of Ohio State, who's a very careful scholar, who thinks there was a legal basis for this to happen. So I think in every state past that one election day 2 weeks ago, when it was really, the crisis really coming to a head, I think every other state is following their own state's procedures and moving the primary. Moving the primary is something that can be done. It doesn't cause any kind of permanent dislocation of people being disenfranchised, so long as there are adequate ways that people can vote, for example, through the mail if they can't show up in person. But we don't have that option for federal election day about moving it. So we'll have to talk about that. And so that's why now we're 7.5 months before the election. There's a lot of planning and work that needs to happen if we're going to have a successful election in November.
Yeah, so let's start with the let's go to the November election then, and I think for a lot of people, and we'll get there, the sort of very scary $1 trillion question is could the election be canceled by President Trump or anybody else? But before we get there, I wanted to there have been a lot of articles, a lot of discussion about what the state should do if the coronavirus continues through into November. And I wanted to get your take on what's being proposed as the various plans and what you would recommend be how this plays out in the coming months before November.
Sure. So I get this question a lot. Can President Trump cancel or postpone the election? And the short answer is not legally. The the Constitution gives Congress the power to set the date of the election, and I think it's an 1845 statute that sets it on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So that's set, and then there's a whole clock by which states have to submit their electoral college votes. So all of that is set in statute. So what could happen that could delay or somehow postpone the election or any of that? Well, I don't know if the president could try to use his powers of martial law or other emergency powers that could close polling places, keep people inside their homes. That would effectively prevent people from voting, but wouldn't delay the election. That could lead to a cascading effect where so this gets a little bit into the weeds, but the Constitution really gives state legislatures rather than states the power to choose the presidential electors who are then sent to Congress. And in Bush versus Gore, the Supreme Court case that ended the 2000 election, the Supreme Court said, although state legislatures have given the people the power to vote directly for president, state legislatures can take back that power anytime. So you can imagine, the Republican legislature in Pennsylvania says, well, we don't think we can have a fair election because people can't get to the polls. So we're just going to vote our own state's electors, electoral college votes. That's a pretty scary situation. I actually predicted people would be rioting in the streets to the extent that they're allowed in the streets, because that would be profoundly anti-democratic with a small d. But that's something that is within those nightmare scenarios, which is all the more reason why I think we want to have expanded no excuse absentee balloting, so that people will have a vote, even if they do not have the full ability to get to a polling place. I think there's also going to have to be some polling place voting.
Let me interrupt just for 1 second, because I think there's a bunch of people who have joined late, to let you know that if you have questions, write them up in the chat room and we'll get to them in the second half of the session. Sorry, Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I think, I'm not an epidemiologist. I can't tell you what the world's going to look like in November, but, it's quite possible that there will be some in-person voting. I think that's likely. By then, we will be practiced in social distancing. And if you have early voting and you have the ability to spread out voting, even maybe schedule appointments for voting, there are ways that in-person voting could potentially take place as well. There are some people who face disabilities, for example, who might prefer to vote in person. There's some people who are distrustful. Excuse me. There's some people who are distrustful of vote by mail. So I think, vote by mail has got to be a big part of what we would do in November. But, we also have to take into account, how is voter registration going to work? Not every state has online voter registration. If DMVs are closed, that could affect who's going to be able to register to vote. You can't go door to door and get people to fill out papers if people can't be in contact with each other. So, it's really concerning because lots and lots of people register to vote in the 7 months between the primaries and election day.
Move. A lot of people during that time.
Right.
So
very important point.
Which also, brings up the point that if everyone, for example, as many are recommending, was sent a mail ballot, making sure that all of those addresses are correct, because you could have a lot of people disenfranchised because they have moved and the address is incorrect in the voter registration database. So, and as is being discussed in the media, there are other challenges to trying to go towards tremendous vote by mail, both because of the money it would cost and other just really technical stuff that's important, like the signature matching issues on absentee ballots and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be a huge challenge. I wanted to take advantage of your legal scholarship to ask you some of the legal issues around this. Now, we've talked a little bit about this, and so as I understand it from the book and what you said, there are some states that do have laws that could possibly cover who's in charge of this situation, but then there are a lot of states who don't have laws designating who can make changes in the election procedures. So what's up there? What are we supposed to do with that?
Sure. So what will end up happening in those states is, if the legislature doesn't give authority, or the lines of authority are unclear, some actor will take a step. to make a change, and that will provoke a lawsuit, and then the courts will have to decide who has the power to do what. We already know, and I give these statistics in Election Meltdown, that the amount of election litigation has almost tripled in the period post-2000 compared to the pre-2000 period. In 2018, I think we had the largest number of election-related lawsuits ever, which is really unusual in my data because of this is usually in a midterm election, we see lower levels of litigation. So, you know, even before the pandemic, I was predicting we'd have a record level amount of litigation. I now think we're certainly going to have that because of all of the virus-related changes that are taking place, many of which are well-intentioned. I certainly think that the Ohio Governor DeWine, he was not making a power play in trying to cancel the election. This was not some kind of, you know, like the North Carolina legislature stripping powers from the governor, doing something totally political. He was trying to protect the public. It's just that he lacked the authority. So even well-meaning people might feel the need to make changes related to the elections, but those could have important political ramifications, which gives me a chance to say one of the most important things that I conclude in Election Meltdown is that we need to have the rules of the game established as far in advance as possible, because the closer you are to an election, the more it is possible to determine who the winners and losers are of some election change that you propose. Already you see Republicans complaining that expanded vote by mail, which Democrats were pushing for in this COVID bill, would create a situation where it's going to politically benefit Democrats. So we want to pick rules that are fair. So for example, we don't know if it's going to be Texas or California that might be under a temporary lockdown during the November election. One might help a Democrat, one might help a Republican, but let's have the rules known now, fair rules that we can establish behind a veil of ignorance, so that way nobody can say, well, you're just trying to game the system. I mean, that's a generalizable point, but it's an especially important point right now.
And that, I mean, so that litigation would take place in state courts. Could it end up in the Supreme Court? I mean, the courts themselves are, as you also point out, so polarized and politicized. Also, how does that go down?
So, you know, questions of state election procedures and compliance with the state constitution are state court questions, but they also raise federal questions under the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so just about any kind of election dispute could end up as a federal dispute. And whether it's a federal dispute or it's a dispute in state court, to the extent it raises constitutional issues, US constitutional issues, it could end up in the United States Supreme Court. And one of the points I made in Election Meltdown, which of course, as you mentioned at the top, was written before the virus was a thing, or a thing that we knew about anyway, what is that in 2000, the Supreme Court was able to resolve Bush versus Gore. It was 5-4 decision. It pitted the liberals against the conservatives, but you may remember that the 4 liberals who were on the losing end included 2 Republican appointed justices, John Paul Stevens and David Souter. Now the court is divided not only along liberal conservative lines, it's also divided along party lines. So all the conservatives were appointed by Republican presidents, all the liberals were appointed by Democratic presidents. And so it's very possible to imagine a situation where there's some election-related dispute, it goes to the Supreme Court, the court divides 5-4 with all the Republican appointed justices siding with Trump and all the Democratic appointed justices siding with Biden or whoever the nominee is, and that would be seen as much less legitimate than Bush versus Gore. Sure, people were very sore about Bush versus Gore, still, some people still are, you know, 20 years later, and yet, the country was able to move on. I think things are much more polarized, and as I talk about a lot in Election Meltdown, social media really exacerbates the kind of partisan tensions that we have in the country. And you know, people would just be completely outraged on the left if you had the Republican Supreme Court, as Democrats would frame it, handing yet another election to a Republican president. So I worry if things end up in court about having the Supreme Court on a partisan split decide issues related to the outcome of the election.
Which, as you said, makes it all the more imperative that both the practices are in place early and any litigation that might ensue from them be resolved as early as possible and hopefully accepted by people so it doesn't go that far.
Right. Well, one of the problems is some of the litigation you can't anticipate until after the election. Somebody's challenging something that doesn't happen until after. But the clearer the rules are in advance, the less kind of room there is for judges and justices to see things differently. And again, I'm not impugning the integrity of any judge, but we do know from election litigation generally and from the Bush versus Gore in particular that you tend to see things through your own ideological lens, and motivated reasoning is a very powerful factor even among judges. And so we want clear rules so that judges can confine themselves to following those clear rules.
Right. Okay. Well, we hope for the best, even given what we got. So I'm going to move on to some of the other pieces of the book for now. And then as people have questions about the impact of coronavirus on all of this and what we should do moving forward, please bring up your questions in the chat room and we'll be addressing those in a few minutes. So to get to the book itself, which is not at all unrelated, but, and there are many points that are relevant to this situation. There are a lot of points that are going to be relevant both now and after this election that are really important to discuss. And so in the book, you point to basically 4 different ways in which, in tandem, elections could melt down. Vote suppression, bad election administration, dirty tricks, and incendiary language. Do you want to just very briefly explain what you mean by each of those?
Sure. So I would say before the virus, I was doing this every day, and then now it's all virus all the time. So it's
you
nice
forgot
to
what the book's
something
about.
else. Yes. So what I talk about in the book are 4 reasons why Americans' trust in the fairness and legitimacy of the elections is decreasing. Right? So my concern is, why is it that Americans are less likely to believe that the election is conducted fairly? Just this morning, I saw both Bernie Sanders supporters and Republicans on Twitter saying that, putting $400 million into the coronavirus stimulus bill is meant to rig the election.
Oh boy.
There's so much talking about this now. So why are people talking about this? And so in the first chapter, I talk about all of these laws that have been passed just about exclusively by Republican legislatures that make it harder for people to register and to vote. And I talk about this is done in the name of preventing voter fraud, but the social science evidence is pretty conclusive. And I run through a pretty colorful trial that took place in Kansas involving Chris Kobach, kind of a notorious purveyor of the idea that voter fraud is rampant. I show how basically, while Kobach had claimed that the amount of non-citizen voting he had proven in court was the tip of the iceberg, the federal district court judge, a 4th-generation Kansas Republican African-American woman judge, said, there is no iceberg. There's only an icicle made up mostly of administrative error. And this fight over voter fraud and voter suppression and these laws that are passed, I think, convinces both Republicans and Democrats that the system is rigged. Republicans believe there's a lot of voter fraud going on, which is not true. And Democrats believe these laws are passed and aimed to suppress the vote, which I think that is probably the aim of these laws, although many of these laws seem to have much less suppressive effect, like voter ID laws, than we would have expected. I could talk about why that is if we want as a follow-up. So one reason is this voter fraud, voter suppression fight that's been going on. A second reason that we see problems with our elections is that the way in which elections are conducted, because they're so decentralized, we end up with pockets of incompetence in election administration. I give the example of Brenda Snipes, who was she was the Broward County election administrator. In one election, she failed to mail out 58,000 absentee ballots to a person, to voters who had requested them. In another election, she left a medical marijuana initiative off the ballot. Election after election, there were problems. She was continuously reelected to office as a Democrat in a Democratic county, and she just did a terrible job. And I talk about the 2018 election where there was a very close recount. This was the race between Bill Nelson, the incumbent U.S. Senator in Florida, and Rick Scott, who was the governor who became the U.S. Senator from Florida. And I just talk about how these weak links in election administration really take on an oversized role if we're talking about trust. So when there's a close election, we don't focus on the 95% of the places where things are done great. We focus on the the small percentage of places where things are done terribly, and then you have accusations of voter fraud coming out, or election fraud, by President Trump, for example, who accused Snipes of deliberately cheating.
Well, I was going to say, let's just interrupt for 1 second, that the voter suppression, the voter fraud, and the bad election administration tend to merge, strange and vague ways by everybody. And it's very hard to tell sometimes, right, which is bad election administration and what is vote suppression. I would actually present as an example your discussion of Georgia and the Secretary of State Kemp there overseeing his own election as Secretary of State for governor, and the extent to which maybe that was bad election administration or intentional suppression. Sometimes it's hard to tell. It's, how you view things. So what's your answer to trying to sort that out?
Well, so I don't try and sort it out because I think these things are working synergistically with each other. And they feed on each other. And so Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State, I kind of say, if Brenda Snipes was the worst local election administrator in the country, Kemp was surely the worst state election administrator in the country. And I talk about how 3 days before the election on the Secretary of State's website in Georgia, the website people went to find out what they're voting on, where they should vote and all of that, he had falsely accused Democrats of trying to hack into the state voter registration database and said that he was bringing in the FBI. And this was right there on the homepage. And what in fact was going on was that a citizen had discovered that after years of problems with the security of the state voter registration database in Georgia, the citizen had found another hole in the system. He could go in and with a couple of keystrokes, he could get all the files on all the voters in the state. And he called the Democrats' election protection hotline, as well as some plaintiffs who were involved in a lawsuit against Kemp. Democrats reported to some computer scientists to check out, who turned to a national security agency. Next thing you know, there's an investigation. And so rather than fess up that he had a hole in his election system, Kemp turned it around and tried to make it as though Democrats were hacking into the system when Democrats had done no such thing.
But there were, so there were a lot of things that went on in Georgia, hence, Stacey Abrams and, the entire fight there and the fight that she continues. And I would probably sort of lean more towards this was a vote suppression thing than bad election administration than you do. So it's hard to sometimes sort that out, as you say.
Sure. But so just to go through, because I'll come back to Stacey Abrams in a second. So the third reason that I think people's confidence in the election is going down is because there are these kind of newfangled and old-fashioned dirty tricks. So everything from the Russian hacking, stealing of emails, releasing them, and the misinformation, and the provocative stuff that was put on social media, and the probing of state voter registration databases. We saw all of those dirty tricks, which also feed into claims of rigging and cheating and all of that, as well as old-fashioned vote tampering, like we saw in North Carolina's 9th congressional district in 2018, where there was a political operative who helped a Republican illegally gather up absentee ballots in violation of North Carolina state law. We think some of those ballots were destroyed or votes were changed. And so there are, pockets of problems in this country. Voter fraud, election fraud is rare, but it sometimes does happen. So those stories get lots of play, and they make people think that, just like when you hear about, again, back to the virus, you hear about people dying, you tend to think that everyone who gets this virus is seriously ill. I think we hear about problems with election administration or election crimes, and we think the whole system is broken, because that's what gets the most attention. And then the final area is why trust is declining, is this increasingly incendiary rhetoric about rigged and stolen elections. And so here I want to come back to Stacey Abrams, because I'm very critical of some of the things that Abrams and her supporters said, even though I believe that Kemp both engaged in attempted voter suppression and was incompetent.
Okay.
So
Great combination.
I concede those things, no question.
Right.
But I think to say, to refuse to say that Kemp was the legitimate governor of Georgia, or for Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio U.S. Senator to say that the election was stolen. I would really reserve that rhetoric for times when you can actually prove that an election result was altered because of someone's attempted suppression or fraud. And I think when you start throwing around this loose language, it's problematic in a few ways. First, it gets you into a debate over, is there enough evidence that this actually affected the results of the election, which often can't be proven because so many things can affect election results and turnout. But also, it puts the focus in the wrong place. The focus should be on the dignity of each voter and whether each voter should have, should the state be able to put stumbling blocks in front of voters for no good reason, like onerous registration requirements, voter purges, exact match requirements. We saw a lot of this stuff in Georgia. I'd rather ask, why does the state get to disenfranchise people or put up these barriers for no good reason? And I think also, just in terms of your own supporters, if you're trying to get people to the polls, if you tell them their votes are being stolen, why are they going to go vote? And so I think it kind of is demoralizing to be hearing this kind of language. So I think there's a place for strong rhetoric, and I certainly have no problem saying that Brian Kemp was incompetent. Brian Kemp tried to suppress votes, but to call an election stolen or rigged, I think takes it to a different level. And of course, Trump does this all the time. Trump famously claimed with no evidence whatsoever that 3 to 5 million votes of people in the 2016 election were illegal votes cast by non-citizens. He claimed all of them in favor of Hillary Clinton. There's no evidence to support this whatsoever. And the only person who's really come to Trump's defense on this is Chris Kobach, who also makes these completely unsupported claims. And so I think, it's really dangerous when we start talking about rigged or stolen elections, because our elections depend upon, a democracy depends upon the losers saying, okay, this was a hard-fought election, but the election was conducted fairly. I'm going to fight again to win in 4 years. I'm going to fight again next time. And if you don't believe that the election was conducted fairly, then how do you have a democracy? And so it's really important that we have peaceful transitions of power, that losers accept results. This is not a discussion we were having even 10 years ago. When George Bush handed power to Barack Obama in January 2009, we didn't think, whoa, maybe Bush won't leave office, right? It never crossed anybody's minds. And now we're having these crazy kinds of discussions. And this is the concern I have. And of course, now with all of this virus-related stuff, turnout may be down, things may be done not in the way that they're normally done, and there's going to be lots of room for accusations of fraud. And we need to have as clean and clear an election as possible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I actually do have 1 or 2 more questions, but I'm going to hold on them because we do have a bunch of questions from everyone in the audience that I'm going to start asking, and I'll shut up. So I think a lot of this will go back to concerns around the November election. The first question is, how are the demographics of the voters changed when a state goes to all mail balloting, and how do states make sure that people who move get a ballot?
Yeah, so I should say I'm not an advocate for states that haven't already done it to move to all mail balloting for November. We don't know what November is going to look like. Some people are not going to want to or not going to be able to vote by mail. For example, it's very hard for people on Indian reservations to be able to vote by mail. Native Americans have lots of access problems to US mail. And it took the states that have moved to all mail or mostly all mail elections years to perfect their systems. So I don't think we're talking about all vote by mail, but we're talking about expanded vote by mail. So I would favor, for example, I favor congressional legislation that would require the 1/3 of states that don't allow no excuse absentee balloting, meaning you can vote for any reason, to be able to vote without an excuse just for November. I'm not talking about a permanent change. I don't think there should be any permanent changes in voting rules.
And you can do that, right? I mean, I think that's an important point, that this is, this is emergency legislation or an emergency executive order, and it doesn't mean that states are going to all vote by mail forever now.
Yeah, although the Democrats in the Pelosi bill on the Democratic side were proposing changes that would apply past this election. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think that's going to be in the final bill, but that was kind of their marker that they laid down. I think you should not use this as an opportunity to be making major changes. We need to deal with November. Okay, so there's going to be expanded vote by mail, whether Congress passes legislation and funds things or not. We already know, I think the latest figures I saw was in Wisconsin, the number of absentee ballot requests has either tripled or quadrupled from normal for their upcoming primary. So there's going to be more expense. You need more scanners. You need more people who are checking those ballot envelopes. There's more of a chance of people being disenfranchised because their signatures might not match. So you need protections to make sure that voters who have a ballot booted get a chance to cure and prove, no, this really is my signature. This is my ballot.
Right.
In terms of the demographics, traditionally it had been Republicans much more than Democrats that have taken advantage of vote by mail. In recent years, that's shifted as Democrats have adopted a strategy of trying to get the early vote in, trying to bank that vote. And Democrats tend to vote later than Republicans, even when they're voting early, but they vote later in the period and they vote later in the absentee period.
Interesting.
I don't know what the political ramifications would be. You know, it used to be if you were older, whiter, and wealthier, you both were more likely to vote by mail and more likely to vote Republican. That was at least the story in California. Judging by the reactions of some of the more conservative members of Congress to the Democrats' vote by mail proposals, they tend to think that it's going to help Democrats. I'm not sure that there's empirical evidence that supports that, but that's kind of the common wisdom. And
well, I mean, it might depend on who does a better mobilization job and education job among their people, right?
Sure, right. And what was there was a latter part of that question.
How are states going to make sure that people get their ballots, especially if they move?
Right. You know, this is going to be a problem. I don't know how states are going to do that. You know, what if postal system is disrupted? You know, we're saying vote by mail as though, you know, of course the mail system is going to be perfect, but the postal service is now going to need a bailout, from what I understand. That's going to be in phase 4.
Separate and apart from this.
Right. Unrelated to this. So we need to have lots of backup plans in place. One person said to me, you know, if someone is very virulently anti-Trump, I would walk through the plague to vote in person, you know, against Donald Trump. And I said, well, that, you know, that depends on the polling place being open. You know, people may be motivated on both sides, you know, in this election. You know, we've been talking about a turnout tsunami in this election. Now, you know, kind of turnout models are all uncertain because we don't know what things are going to be like. But let me underline something you said earlier, because I think it was super important. If people can't register to vote, people have moved.
Right.
They're not going to be able to vote. And so registration is just as important as actually voting when you're thinking about protecting the November election. If there are millions of people who can't vote, I mean, because they're not registered, because they've been displaced or they've moved to an area and they can't get to a physical place to register to vote, and there's no online voter registration, those people risk disenfranchisement too.
Also, does that
raise... It's not true everywhere. This is true in some places.
So does this raise the need for the states, through whatever power that be, to also move the registration deadlines or even the same day registration for this? Is that possible?
Well, I think moving registration deadlines is possible. Same day voter registration is a tough thing to roll out. We saw in Los Angeles County, California now has same-day voter registration, but it used to be you'd have to go to the main election office to do that. Now they let you do it at the polling place. That was one of the reasons in Los Angeles County we saw these really long lines. I think it's very hard, even with the best of intentions, to try to roll out same-day voter registration in a place that doesn't have it. You need to have your e-poll books working. You know, you need to have the mechanics in place to be able to do that. So I don't know, but you know, it wouldn't surprise me if there are tough voter registration deadlines in states that we're going to see lawsuits trying to extend voter registration, require online voter registration. Remember, the courts are going to play a role here. There's going to be litigation that's going to try to force states to open things up. And sometimes state law won't allow opening things up for voter registration, and a court may be the only way that this is going to happen.
Right. So I heard that even in Ohio now, after all this has been done, that there is a lawsuit because even though they've moved their primary to June, they did not move the voter registration deadline, so nobody new can register, even though, so anyway.
Right, yeah, that lawsuit is ongoing, I believe.
Yeah. So the next question is about petitioning, and the questioner asked about candidates who need to petition their way onto the ballot, but I would also include in their ballot initiatives that are still requiring signatures. What do we do about all that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough question. In a number of states, say the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, they need to collect signatures in order to get back on the ballot, and they may not be able to. I went to a supermarket last week to get some essentials, and there was a petition gatherer guy with a table gathering signatures, and nobody wants to go near him. I mean, I can't blame them. You know, usually they get a few people who are signing things up. I mean, I'm much less concerned about the initiative process being stuck, because things can always be put on a later ballot. right? So, medical marijuana, you can always vote on it 2 years later. But, about candidates qualifying, and independent candidates, especially difficult, even harder than the Green Party, at least the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, they have kind of some basis of support. And, you could have states agreeing to grandfather them in, say, well, if you qualified in 2016, you qualify for 2020. I don't know if states would do that. I don't know if there'll be lawsuits if states do that,
Right.
trying to change those. But if you're a truly independent candidate, say you want to be an independent candidate for president, I don't see how you can run as independent candidate for president and collect signatures in the number of states you would need to get on the ballot. It's just, people can't be out there collecting signatures when there are orders to stay at home. And people are not going to want to open their doors, understandably. So it's a huge problem, and I'm not sure that there is a good solution for that one.
And that actually leads to the next question, which is, what are the organizations and advocacy groups who do voter registration and turnout, for that matter, on the ground through canvassing? What can they do?
I don't know. There are a few places where there's electronic gathering of signatures that's allowed. It seems unlikely to me that you're going to see state legislatures. Some of the state legislatures can't even meet, but the ones that are meeting, I don't think this is going to be at the top of their list. I think this is going to be one of those casualties of this war, where it's really problematic. I don't have a good answer to that question.
I guess groups are going to have to be incredibly creative about the use of social media, and see where that goes.
Yeah, well, so for voter registration, you could potentially, depending on your state, or I think maybe, and you probably know this better than I do, maybe you can print out the federal postcard for voter registration and mail it in.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, then I think there needs to be, an extensive campaign to get people to do that.
Well, and it also goes back to moving registration deadlines, having greater education around registration deadlines, having more online registration. And I would just add to that, actually, on the online registration, I think, at least anecdotally, we know that a lot of people go to register online, get confused by it because a lot of the states have crappy websites, honestly, that are hard to navigate, and they drop off. And so either they need to do a better job of that at the state level, or there needs to be much more guidance and education around how you can register to vote online.
Yeah, I think this is going to require a lot of creativity on the part of both the political parties and nonpartisan voter registration groups like the League of Women Voters. How are you going to run a virtual voter registration drive? And some of that is, how do you reach people? And some of that is, what are the mechanics? How are you going to get people the forms that they need in order to register them to vote, and for people to re-register to vote? I mean, I think there's no excuse for states not to have online voter registration.
Right.
I was at a panel in Texas a few years ago, and they said, if you can make one change to the voting system in Texas, which has had so many issues, from redistricting to voter ID, to what change would you make? It online voter registration, no question, because we know Republican states like Ohio and Florida, they do it. If there's no fraud problem, it's efficient, because if you write your name on a form and it has to be transposed by someone who's doing data entry, they might misspell your name. Both of us have names that can be misspelled, I know, and often it becomes difficult. Like, no, look me up again. Online voter registration makes the most sense, and I just wish more states would do it, and it would make it so much easier, especially for people who've moved and are already in the system. It would then easily alert, here's my old voter registration, here's the new one, and have clean voter registration rolls, which is in everyone's interest.
Although I would also point out, though, even in the states, except for a small handful, in the states that have online voter registration, you have to have a driver's license or state-issued ID in order to register online. And so that does exclude a certain number.
I think you can use the last four of your social, if I recall.
I don't think in most states you can. So that's another thing I feel like, and this is unlikely to happen, but that states would need to relax some of those requirements and go to other ways of verifying your voter registration other than having a signature on file, because that's gonna cut out people, and there'll be people who don't drive, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so this, Doug Chapin of the University of Minnesota likes to say, there's no small stuff when it comes to election administration. I think that's really true, that, these nitty-gritty details really matter, and that the difference between people being able to express their views and vote or not. And so we've got to pay attention to these details.
Yeah, exactly. I want to go back to something in the book for just a second, as people are also formulating more questions. We do have more, but I wanted to get this in, since maybe it's just my own desire to hear you answer the question. But so the voter fraud myth, and you have what you call, talk about in the book, and I think very central in the first chapter, the voter fraud squad, right? As you
The fraudulent fraud squad.
What is it called?
The fraudulent fraud squad.
I'm sorry, me of all people, and I got that wrong. Okay, so as you have notoriously labeled them, so these guys have been around for quite a while now, and in some ways, so they, I mean, not unlike us in some ways, have created industries around their work, but they have, you know, maintained their presence, kept going, influenced Trump, been in the Trump administration. And I would say, even after all these years of you and everybody else in the community and scholars and journalists demonstrating that there is very little voter fraud, that nobody believes us. And so even with the Kobach case, which you talked about a lot, as having sort of really lifted the hood on that, people still don't believe it, and they still believe that people should have to show ID in order to vote. And so this is my own bafflement maybe, but why is it that given all this evidence, do people still believe that there is voter fraud, and certainly still believe that a voter identification, a driver's license or whatever, is the way to address the problem?
Well, I think it's because it's messaging that people have been hearing. I mean, there's a huge partisan divide on this issue.
Right.
I should say voter ID is widely popular among Democrats and Republicans. Because I think, and that's not because people think there's a lot of fraud, but because they think, you know, that's just a common sense method, and most people have an ID. You know, so they don't recognize that, you know, the 10 to 20% of people who might lack that right kind of ID that's going to allow them to vote. But I think, you know, the main reason for what you're describing is the fact that this message has been pounded for 20 years by this industry of hucksters who are using this as an excuse to try to pass laws that make it harder to register and vote. And there's no way around it. And so by the end of Election Meltdown, I say it's time for journalists to stop portraying this in a kind of both sides, he said, she said type of situation. Every story should say, you know, the fact is that election fraud is extremely rare in this country, and that the kinds of fraud that a voter identification law would prevent, like impersonation fraud, is pretty much non-existent. That, you know, there are almost no cases of concerted efforts to try and steal a vote in this way, because it would be a completely dumb way to try and steal an election. So if I wanted to steal a local election, I'm going to find, you know, 50 people to go into polling places, 100 people, 1,000 people, tell them, here's the name of someone who's dead or moved, go pretend you're that person. I'm going to give you $20. I can't verify how you're going to vote or if you even do anything when you go in the polling place, because it's a secret ballot. And there's going to be enough of this that's going to swing an election. Just not happening. When we see election fraud, it tends to happen with tampering with absentee ballots, which is one of the reasons why I have some concern over vote by mail being expanded. But we can talk about that.
That's one of the questions in the queue, actually, is, you know, you have talked about absentee balloting as the one kind of area where there's a little bit of fraud that's possible. So now we're all saying everybody absentee ballot. So, you know, what about that?
So I do think it's a real problem, you know, and it's been you know, it's absentee ballot fraud is rare, but if you look, for example, there was a database of all of the election prosecutions in the United States that researchers could track down from 2000 to 2012. About a quarter of the cases involved absentee ballot fraud, compared to like 0.05 involving impersonation fraud, just to give you a sense of the difference in scale. But yet we allow absentee voting. We have states with all vote by mail that have pretty clean records because it's tremendously convenient for voters. It's very easy. Here we're in the midst of this, you know, potential continued disruption because of the pandemic. And we have to take some risks. And one of those risks is the possibility of ballot tampering. So I think there are a few ways to deal with this. Number one, you need to have prosecutors being very careful to make sure that they're going after people like the people in the North Carolina 9th Congressional District who are engaged in this fraud. And how did we find this fraud? Because there were really unusual patterns. So in an area that was heavily Democratic, almost all the ballots were coming in voting Republican, you know, so that looked weird. So you could look for patterns of, or like a huge increase in the collection of vote by mail. Number two, and here I've gotten into a big fight with Mark Elias, who's a lawyer for the Democrats. Mark wants unlimited community collection of ballots. Like anybody can collect absentee ballots from anyone. I think that's a big problem. It's so-called ballot harvesting, because that's what we saw in that 9th congressional district race in North Carolina. It was illegal to collect ballots there, but whether it's legal or not, it does create the risk that ballots could be destroyed or votes could be changed. And so I like Colorado's rule. Colorado has basically all vote by mail. I mean, you could vote in person, but it's mostly vote by mail. But they say you can't collect more than 10 absentee ballots from a person. I think I have an exemption for areas that do not have regular U.S. Postal Service coverage, like Native American reservations. But you know, I would put limits on the community collection of ballots, as Mark is calling it. And you know, the third thing is that I don't favor mailing everyone an absentee ballot if, you know, there hasn't been, you know, as opposed to an absentee ballot request, right? I think fine to mail everyone an absentee ballot request, mail it back. But I don't want ballots out there to the extent that voting rolls are not clean, to the extent that they have people who died or moved. You don't want ballots floating out there of people who are gone, they're just lying out there. So I don't favor that either. So I think we need to have protections in place, because it unlike the icicle of voter impersonation fraud, I think absentee ballot fraud it's small, but it's real, and we need to take care that it doesn't create a problem, especially because, right, if the election is close, oh, it's from all that fraud coming from those absentee ballots in California. We already heard that in 2018 when Democrats ended up winning 7, as I talk about in Election Meltdown, ended up winning 7 races for Congress in Southern California, where Republicans were ahead on election night. But as the votes came in, those late coming Democratic absentee ballots shifted the votes from Republican to Democrat. There's already so much mistrust. We don't want to add to the mistrust.
Well, and that actually gets to the 2 points that are related. One, the other thing that you talk about a lot in the book is the role of the media and using the right type of terminology around election results, that, you know, these projections on CNN and, you know, wherever, Fox, are, you know, not all the ballots. Can take days to count all the ballots, to be very careful about how they talk about elections, which gets to a bigger topic that a lot of people are asking about, and I was going to ask about too, is this issue of trust. That you talk about, that, I mean, at the end of the day, all of the different things that you talk about in the book, it really comes down to this impacting people's trust and faith in the elections process and the political process. And there are a lot of different angles into that. And so what are your recommendations for building trust? And will we ever have the kind of, and maybe it was, you know, naive trust that we had sort of pre-2000, when you would have, you know, a Carter Ford commission, like how I got my start, you know, where people were like, okay, I trust those guys, they know what they're doing.
This was a perfect softball, although you didn't realize it to me.
Okay.
So just before the coronavirus stuff really hit, I convened a group. We had a conference at UCI Law called "Can American Democracy Survive the 2020 Elections?" And you can go to law.uci.edu/2020 election or election 2020. Try them both, and you'll find you can watch the videos. We brought in election administrators, and we had the Secretary of State of Ohio and of Michigan, and we talked about this. And that was day one. Day two was a smaller group, not the election officials, but mostly academics. And we created an ad hoc group, and we are going to come out with recommendations, I hope, with about a month for, I think it'll be 20 steps or fewer that can improve the trust in and confidence of American voters in elections, beginning with things like the media needs to be much more careful in terms of explaining that late counted votes don't mean that there's anything wrong going on. That means that people are being careful, and that there may be a few days before we know who the president is, because, you know, the vote counting in Michigan and Pennsylvania, 2 states that moved to no excuse absentee balloting, are going to have a flood of absentee balloting. It's going to take days to process those votes. And so, you know, training the news media. But the 4 areas we looked at are law, tech, politics, and media, and we're going to have recommendations in each of those areas. So stay tuned for that. We are looking, and it's all aimed at one thing. What can we do to ensure that we have a fair and legitimate election that people can trust? Because here's what we know. Here's the bottom line. We know that 47–48% of the public is going to be very unhappy with the results of the election, at least, right? At least that many. regardless of who wins. And so
Right.
how do you assure those people, they think, it's going to be catastrophic if the other side wins. How do you assure those people that this was a fair election? Now, we're not going to convince everybody, but as many people as possible.
And so the recommendations that you'll be coming out with, will those, fix the problem in time for 2020 so that
Well, so
I'd stay
the charge I gave to the group was, this is stuff that could be done in the next 7 months. This is not long-term. We're not talking about, reform the electoral college, great topic for an academic conference. But we're talking about what can we do, actionable things now, between now and November, to try to, it's a multifaceted problem. It means it needs a multifaceted solution, and every step forward in trying to instill trust and a fair process is going to help with this improving people's confidence. At least that's the hope.
So Rick, can you just for a second, and maybe one of the hosts can put it in the chat room, the website that you just mentioned to be checking out?
Yes, so I believe it's law.uci.edu/ it's either election 2020 or 2020 election. I would go and type it, but it's one of those. But if you go to my election law blog, which is electionlawblog.org, I'll post a link to that after this is over, just so people can find it. That may be easier. Electionlawblog.org. Oh, somebody put it up there on the chat.
Great.
So it's law.uci.edu/events/election-law/election-2020. I think we had a shorter one, but that'll take you
close.
Yeah, there you go.
And the report will come out there, and we can try and help to disseminate that too. Okay, I'm being told there are 3 last questions. So let me I guess I can end a little bit with this, which is, this has been a fairly scary and depressing conversation, as most conversations are right now. Do you have any optimism? And this is combining 2 questions, actually. Do you have some optimism for what will happen in November? Do you think there's a chance that there will actually be a coming together and then maybe a little bit less polarization as people sort of try to pull together and make sure this happens? Is that even a possibility in your head?
Well, I saw this as going to be the most polarized election of our lifetimes. Maybe if there's one thing positive that can come out of this coronavirus pandemic that we're facing, is that people will see this as a war against a common enemy,
right?
And come together in that way. I'm not all that optimistic because we're seeing misinformation coming out of the White House now about the virus. But just like it was hard to imagine a month ago that we'd be in a situation where we have to communicate virtually, I thought I was going to be in Boston today, sitting next to you.
Yes.
We don't know what things are going to look like in a month, or much less than 7 months. I hope that we don't have tens of thousands of deaths, but if we do, that may affect the national mood and the national culture. Maybe that would make us less partisan. I don't know. But we're in a time of tremendous uncertainty. There's not much I can do about the virus, but I can, my area is elections, and I'm really trying to figure out how we can continue to have fair elections under these very difficult circumstances.
Well, thank God you are, and I'm sure that you have assembled a team of people who are all the most brilliant minds in the country around this. And so thank you for everything you've done on election law over the last 20 years. I don't know how, you have contributed so much. And I just wanted to shout out again your election law blog as sort of the go-to place for these conversations, both in terms of being on top of all the things that are being written about this, but also a lot of the debates among the leading scholars on this. If you want to just repeat, it's electionlaw.org.
Electionlawblog.org is the election law blog. And the book itself, you can get information at electionmeltdown.com.
Yeah, that's great. All right.
I should say the book is available in electronic form from on Kindle or other sources. So you can you don't have to wait for the book to arrive physically in order to be able to read it.
Which is helpful. And I would just also say, having read it a couple of times now, the thing that's great about it is that actually there are some stories about how these things have actually played out that really illustrate the types of topics that we're talking about that can seem very technical and administrative, but have tremendous real life implications for our election system. Okay, so I guess with that, we will wrap it up so Rick, any final comments on your part? And I'm thinking that maybe we should have another convening, in a couple of months to see where we are, and you can explain what the hell we should do then at that point.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. What I would say is that just like, we can't sacrifice our democracy in a real war, we can't sacrifice our democracy when we're facing this virus. And it's critical infrastructure. It's part of what makes us a great nation. And so let's do what we can to assure that as many people as possible will have the chance to exercise the franchise and we have a successful election in November.
Absolutely. I think we all agree with that. All right, Rick, I hope that we will see you again if you're willing.
Sure.
Keep on top of this. And
thank you for your work in this area, which has been incredibly important. And I'm glad we're able to have this conversation in this way.
Yeah, no, great to talk to you. Wish I was seeing you, but hopefully we can soon too.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks to everyone for joining us. We had a great group. I think this was really successful. So, and we will see you all again very soon. Any last words from anybody else? Okay.
I'll just chime in, Tova, that this was great.
Definitely.
Thank everybody for joining. We had about almost 170 people. So this is, I would say this is a good first step and an encouragement for us to keep doing it more. So we'll do these things again and we'll keep people posted.
Great. Okay, thanks everybody. Stay healthy. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.